It was Saturday evening. The sun had just set, creating the kind of twilight that makes you wonder whether you should turn on your headlights or not. Mark Evans didn't have to make that choice. He was just pulling into his garage on a quiet residential street in Sharpsburg. A moment later, a slender, dark-haired man emerged from a side door carrying a duffel bag, a briefcase, and a laptop computer. His years of experience allowed him to handle the three bulky items with ease. One could not travel as much as he had to without developing such skills. He unlocked and entered the side door of his house, but did not call out to his wife Lisa to inform her of his arrival. He already knew she was not home. Instead, he made his way into the living room with his briefcase and laptop, placing the bag of clothes at the foot of the stairs leading to the second floor of their modest but cozy home. Placing the two items on the couch, he removed his coat and carried it to the closet near the front door, where he hung it on the familiar coat rack. Only now that both hands were free and he was in the comfort of his own home, did he remove his jacket and tie and undo the top two buttons on his white shirt. He didn't normally wear such formal business attire, but today he had returned from a regional meeting of managers working for his employer, ABC Industries. He wasn't technically a manager, but his role as the most knowledgeable systems analyst on staff required his presence at the meetings in Pittsburgh. His immediate supervisor knew how to organize the staff, but he knew next to nothing about the computer systems that kept their business running smoothly. He could have stayed home the night before, but that wasn't part of his plans. Instead, he told his wife that the meeting would be followed by a series of seminars that would last all weekend and that he would be back on Monday. He had his own reasons for telling her that, and he had to lose time most of the day to avoid coming home too early. He also regretted not taking more comfortable clothes with him on the trip, but if he had, Lisa might have wondered why he needed to. He never took anything but formal wear with him to business meetings. Now that he was home, the first order of business was to shower and then change into something more comfortable. 20 minutes after disappearing upstairs with his garment bag, he returned to the main floor dressed in his usual jeans and polo shirt, and looking very fresh after a quick shower. The next half hour was spent getting ready, warming up, and then dinner, which consisted of leftovers from the fridge. Lisa was a good cook, and even the leftovers made a good meal. He washed down the meal with a bottle of top-shelf light beer, one of his weaknesses. After finishing the bottle of beer, he moved to the living room where, reclining in the lazy boy chair, he read the front page of the local newspaper. To any casual observer, he was a typical husband relaxing after a long and arduous trip out of town. In reality, he was just killing time by following his script, patiently waiting for the right time to resolve a serious personal crisis. He had a month to go through the 5 stages of grief alone, and the only one he successfully dealt with was denial. Anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance were all in the moment. He hoped that over the course of the night, he would be able to make progress on at least a few of the remaining 4 stages. It was past midnight and Sunday was just beginning when he was finally satisfied with what the clock showed and got up to return the empty bottle of beer to the kitchen table. He transferred the dirty dishes to the dishwasher and then used a damp cloth to bring the countertop back to pristine condition. As he performed these small tasks, he realized it was just a form of procrastination, a way to make him reconsider his chosen path. Unable to find a new solution to the problem, he walked over to the hall closet and put on a light jacket, then began to make his way to the side door, the beginning of his nightly mission. When his fingertips touched the doorknob, he suddenly jerked his hand away sharply, snapped his fingers, and said, "Damn, I almost forgot." He hurried back into the living room, set his briefcase on the coffee table, and then put his laptop on it. In less than a minute, he had the laptop turned on, logged in, and secured an internet connection through the wireless router located in the computer room he and Lisa kept. A few minutes of typing and sending an email completed the forgotten business, and after logging out and turning off the laptop, he returned to the side door and walked out of the house with a confident, leisurely gait. After spending about 5 minutes in the garage, he pulled up the garage door, pulled into the street, turned on the headlights, and slowly drove away as the garage door closed silently behind him. It was 7:37 a.m. when Sharpsburg's 911 operator answered a new incoming call. "This is your 911 emergency operator. What is the nature of your emergency?" An inaudible female voice, seemingly young, answered through the poor phone connection. I think I need the police. I think a crime has been committed. The 911 operator nonchalantly continued. Where are you located, ma'am? We need your location so we can send police to the call. I, uh, I'm on Park Drive, a payphone on Park Drive near George Washington Park. The word payphone immediately explained the operator's poor connection. What crime has been committed, ma'am? Were you attacked or robbed? The young woman answered with a slight delay. No, it wasn't me. There's nothing wrong with me. I was just jogging through the park on the paved access road, the one that leads to the picnic grounds. There's a car parked at one of the picnic areas. The doors are open, the lights are on inside, and there's blood. A lot of blood. The 911 operator was now very interested in the call and asked, Will an ambulance be needed? Are there any injuries? No, no one was hurt there. At least I didn't see anyone there. There's just an empty car and blood. A few seconds passed before the woman continued. I wasn't really looking around. I was afraid someone would come after me too, so I ran here to the payphone to call you. You did the right thing, I'm sure. A car has already been dispatched and will be on site in less than 10 minutes. Please wait for the officers and let them know exactly where that car is. The caller, seeming a little alarmed, replied, No, I'm not going to wait here. What if whoever did this comes after me? I'm going straight home. The last words were followed by the click of the telephone receiver as she hung up. Hanging up, the 911 operator stared helplessly at the screen where the caller ID was flashing. Damn it. That must have been her joke. I hope I didn't distract those officers from something more important than a coffee break. It was almost 2 o'clock that Sunday afternoon when Detective Peter Nesbitt suddenly straightened up sharply in his seat as the car turned into the driveway of the Evans house. He was already getting out of his unmarked car when a pretty blonde woman with a short haircut stopped in front of the garage. He quickly crossed the street as she got out of her car and quickly said, Excuse me, I'm looking for Mrs. Evans. She turned, pulling a suitcase out from under the seat, and replied, I'm Lisa Evans. She took another look at the detective and continued, Do I know you? No, ma'am. I'm Detective Peter Nesbitt with the Sharpsburg Police Department. I'm here about your husband, Mark Evans. We're trying to locate him in connection with his car being abandoned in George Washington Park this morning. He quickly returned the photo ID and badge to his pocket. Lisa Evans' face showed a look of grave concern for a moment, but then it cleared and she said, Mark is in Pittsburgh right now. He always leaves his car at the airport when he goes on trips like this, so I don't know how it could have been found in the park. You must be mistaken. By this time, Detective Nesbitt had approached her and continued, No, we're sure it's his car. Both the license plate and the VIN match his registration. Confusion appeared on her face and she began to back away slowly toward the side door of her house. If it's his car, it must have been stolen from the airport. I don't know what else I can tell you. The detective was very insistent and spoke again. When was the last time you spoke to your husband? Could you call him now so we can make sure he's really still in Pittsburgh? Does he have a cell phone you could call? Lisa Evans stopped abruptly and turned to face the detective. She set her overnight bag on the ground beside her and began rummaging through her purse for her cell phone. He called me early yesterday morning from Pittsburgh. If you don't mind, I'm going to call him right now. She pressed a few numbers on her cell phone, wanting to show the detective that her husband wasn't in the park. A minute later, the detective's cell phone rang in his jacket pocket. He pulled it out and put it to his ear, then said, Hello, Mrs. Evans. The surprise on Lisa's face was genuine. After a moment, when the shock had passed, she asked, How did you get Mark's cell phone? And the detective disconnected the phone and was just starting to tuck it away in his jacket pocket when she said, You have to give me my husband's cell phone. It must have gotten lost. I'm afraid I can't, Mrs. Evans. It's now evidence in a possible major crime. It was found on the floor in your husband's car. Lisa became concerned again and asked, Major crime? What do you mean? Your husband's car was found early this morning in the middle of George Washington Park. The doors were open and a bullet hole was visible. We searched the park thoroughly and found no one who could have been a victim. We really need to find your husband to rule him out as a victim or perpetrator. Could you try calling him at the hotel in Pittsburgh? Lisa turned toward the house, picked up her briefcase and said, Sure, I can do that. The hotel number is in my address book. He always stays at the same Holiday Inn. I'm sure he left his cell phone in his car and that's why he was there when his car was stolen. Come inside with me, and we'll get to the bottom of this case right away. Detective Nisbet followed her into the kitchen and watched her stow her briefcase and purse, find her notebook, and quickly dial a number, looking absent-mindedly across the hallway into the living room. He distinctly heard the hotel clerk say, "Hello, hello," and saw her hang up the receiver back on the phone. After hanging up, she turned to the ash-faced detective and quickly said, "Mark was at home. His briefcase and laptop are in the living room, on the coffee table." "I don't understand anything." The detective stepped back with a thoughtful expression and pulled his own cell phone from his inside pocket. He quickly dialed the number and said, "Hey Dave, it's Pete. I need you to get in touch with the DA on duty. I need a search warrant for the Evans house. We'll need to search the place to decide if Mr. Evans is involved in a crime as a victim or potential suspect. Bring it here as soon as you get it. I'll be waiting." He hung up the phone and sat down across from Lisa. "A search warrant? Why do you need one? You can search all you want, just ask for one. I want you to find my husband." Detective Nesbitt looked at Lisa impassively and said, "I want to do things by the book, ma'am. If I do an illegal search and it turns out your husband is involved in something illegal, anything I find can't be used in court." Lisa got a little angry and quickly replied, "Illegal? Mark isn't involved in anything illegal. He works with computers, for God's sake." Well, something made him come back to town unexpectedly. Can you think of a single reason why he was here unexpectedly and without the knowledge of you, his wife? Lisa's face lost color again, and she muttered quietly, "God, no. He can't. Oh, no." A somewhat panicked expression appeared on her face, and she remained silent for several seconds, just looking at the detective. Finally, she said, "I have no idea why my husband came home early. All I know is that he's not involved in anything illegal." Her look gradually turned to one full of panic, and she continued, "Oh my God, Mark may be hurt. He's lying somewhere waiting for help. You have to find him." Seeing how distraught she was, Peter Nesbitt showed compassion and spoke to her much more gently. "We don't know anything for sure yet, Mrs. Evans. As a police officer, I have to do the right thing. At the moment, there is no evidence that your husband has done anything wrong or that he is involved in any of this at all. Why don't you make us some coffee while we wait for my partner to get a warrant? There's nothing else we can do right now. All of our duty officers are looking for or searching for your husband." His sympathetic tone and comforting words seemed to help Lisa. She began to relax, and the natural color returned to her face. She got up and began making coffee for the two of them. However, her calm state didn't last long because after his next sentence, Lisa became tense and nervous again. All this happened when he said, "Perhaps while we're having coffee, you can give me the details of how you spent the last 48 hours. Before the case is closed, we'll probably need statements from everyone even remotely involved." Detective Nesbitt decided to linger for a few minutes before getting a preliminary statement from Lisa Evans, and she didn't seem interested in broaching the subject herself. Instead, the two of them sat at the kitchen table drinking coffee while the detective talked about how the car had been discovered and the condition of its interior. Lisa seemed horrified by some of the details, especially the fact that there was an obvious bullet hole in the center of the thoroughly blood-soaked section of the front passenger seat of her husband's car. He also said that, judging from the traces of blood, a second bullet had struck the body, which was lying on firewood on the ground next to the car, and that this bullet was now being extracted from the firewood for examination at the crime lab. The car was towed away for examination, and evidence on it was still being collected. Finally, he reported that the medical examiner and forensic scientist were still examining the scene in detail. They had barely had time to enjoy the second cup of coffee she had made when Detective David Klein, Peter Nesbitt's partner, arrived much earlier than expected with the requested search warrant. He was accompanied by two CSIs, and soon all three were engaged in a systematic and thorough search of the Evans home, and then Lisa's garage and car. While all this was going on, Detective Nesbitt arranged with Lisa to locate her husband's razor and toothbrush so that DNA could be obtained for comparison with the blood evidence already available. Throughout the search, and especially when it came to the DNA comparison, Lisa was in such a depressed state that Detective Nesbitt was forced to take her into the living room, where he asked her to remain seated on the couch while he and other officers finished searching the house. After an hour of fruitless searching, the detectives decided that the only items they would have to return to the station with other than the DNA samples, would be Mark Evans's briefcase and laptop computer. Detective Nesbitt had already figured out that the computer was password protected, and they wouldn't be able to access it until they found a way around it. Mrs. Evans, do you happen to know the password your husband used on his laptop? This question seemed to bring Lisa out of her state of despair and occasional sobs, as it seemed she might be able to help. It used to be his first and last name and then his year of birth. Try Mark 1971. Should work. Unfortunately, it soon became apparent that he had changed his password, as none of the detective's old password choices worked. That's okay, Mrs. Evans. We have experienced computer technicians in our forensics department who will find a way around your husband's password. With any luck, it won't take long. The two items were labeled and stowed in the van used by the two forensic technicians. Left alone with Lisa Evans, Detective Nesbitt decided to broach the subject of getting a preliminary statement from her again. So, Mrs. Evans, I need to get some basic information about your whereabouts this weekend. Let's review Saturday morning and your return here this afternoon. He pulled out a notepad and pen and sat down in his chair to write down her description of how she had spent that period of time. Lisa Evans took a deep breath and began. Until noon on Saturday, I did the usual chores around the house. Mark called me from Pittsburgh, around 1 o'clock or maybe 1:30. We only talked for a few minutes. He said he was sorry he couldn't make it for the weekend. After that, I went shopping until about 4:30 and then came home. After dinner, around 7:30 p.m., I went to a friend's house and stayed the night. This morning I got up late, took my time, and got home, as you know, around 2 o'clock. As she explained, she seemed to grow more and more tense, and by the time she finished, she was staring at the floor and clenching her hands into fists. After writing the last word in the notebook, Detective Nesbitt closed it and sat tapping it with his pen for a few seconds before saying, "We may need further details, Mrs. Evans. That's enough for now, but be prepared to provide more details in a closer time if the course of the case requires it." He slipped the notepad and pen back into his pocket and stood up. Detective Nesbitt was about to leave the house to join the others who were searching Lisa's garage and car. He was sure that the house had been completely checked when he suddenly realized that there was one more item he needed. "Oh, Mrs. Evans, do you have any recent full-length photos of your husband? A good headshot wouldn't hurt either. Right now, we only have a picture of him from the driver's license database. It would be nice to hand out something less official to the patrolman." Saying that, he walked over to the fireplace and looked through some wedding photos while Lisa Evans quickly walked over to the book rack where she picked out a thick photo album. "Here are some nice recent photos, Detective. Take your pick." She returned to her seat on the couch and the detective sat next to her as she opened the album. On the last page were several very suitable photos for his purposes, and perhaps the best of them all. To Mark's right was his wife, and to his left was a tall, well-built man with sandy hair. "This one will do," the detective said, pointing to the group photo. "We can cut you and this guy out." After a few seconds, the detective selected another photo, a very good head and shoulders shot of Mark Evans. "These two photos will be more than enough for our needs." When Lisa took the two photos out of the book and handed them to the detective took another look at them and asked, "Isn't the guy in this picture with you and your husband a relative of his? If he has a sibling or parents who could provide a DNA sample, it might help if they can't get anything useful out of a razor or toothbrush." Lisa quickly replied, "No, that's Blake Moore. He's my husband's best friend since elementary school. My husband doesn't have any relatives nearby." Thanking her for the pictures, Detective Nesbitt walked out to join the others in the garage. He left Lisa sitting at the kitchen table with a wistful look and on the verge of tears. He thought he felt sorry for the woman and the position she was in now. Her husband was missing and may or may not have been involved in a serious shooting. The fact that she didn't know he was even in town made the detective wonder exactly what was going on. Soon the detectives, along with two forensic experts, finished searching the garage and the car. It was when the experts were scrutinizing Lisa's car that they noticed something potentially important and certainly suspicious. Bloodstains were found on the gas and brake pedal, which, when chemically analyzed, turned out to be blood. The decision was made to tow the car to a garage for a thorough inspection and test. While the two technicians gathered their equipment and prepared to leave, the two detectives stepped aside to discuss their feelings about the case. Detective Nesbitt, standing up so that he was facing the side door of the Evans house, turned to his partner. What do you think of Mrs. Evans? I wonder about her from time to time, and that positive blood test on the pedals in her car makes me wonder. Well, as far as Mrs. Evans is concerned, you have an advantage over me. I was just here on a search. She looked like a typical worried wife, but you know how it is. Right now, I wouldn't want to put it on the line whether she's involved in something or just being what she appears to be. Nesbitt suddenly began to stalk toward the side door, saying as he went, "Come with me, Dave. Let's see how she reacts when we tell her about the blood we found and that her car is being towed." The two detectives walked to the side door, knocked, and entered. Lisa Evans was talking on her cell phone and became very startled when the two men entered the kitchen. She quickly disconnected the phone without saying a word to whoever was on the other end of the conversation. "You're back. I thought you were done." Peter Nesbitt stepped aside so his partner had an equal opportunity to observe Lisa Evans. "We thought we were done, too. However, forensics found blood smears on the brake and gas pedal of your car. We're taking your car to the impound lot for a thorough inspection. I hope you don't mind." Lisa looked genuinely shocked as she said, "There's blood in my car. How could it have gotten in there? I didn't see any blood anywhere." The two detectives watched her carefully and he replied, "That's a question we'll likely want an answer to. At this point, we can't know if it's related to the incident in the park, but if it turns out that the blood matches the blood found there, you can be sure we'll be pushing for answers. Oh, and we'll need the shoes you were wearing today." Said, "I wasn't anywhere near the park. I haven't been there in weeks. I don't understand how my car could have blood in it. Certainly my husband's car didn't have blood like you described." As she spoke, she took off her shoes and handed them to Detective Nesbitt. She then sank down on the seat, covered her face with her hands, and began to sob. Both detectives, realizing there was little they could say or do without more information, bid her farewell, leaving her in the same posture, hunched over in the kitchen chair. "What do you think, Dave? Is she what she seems to be? A wife who cares a lot about her husband? Or maybe she's just a good actress? Did you notice she was on the phone when we came in and hung up on whoever it was?" David Klein shook his head and said, "I just don't know, Pete. I just don't know. She seems quite sincere, but you know how these things go. If the blood in the car turns out to be the husband's blood, there's a good chance his spouse was involved. We see it over and over again. Maybe we should make some inquiries about this couple. Talk to their friends and neighbors. Maybe someone knows something that has something to do with this whole case." As for the phone call, she was probably talking to her best friend. Women always turn to their best friend when something goes wrong. Yeah, you're probably right. Good old-fashioned digging can lead to something. I'd like to find out why he came into town 2 days earlier than expected. That could be the key to unraveling the whole case. Reaching the car, Detective Nesbitt pulled out a plastic evidence bag, put a pair of shoes in it, and sealed the bag tightly. Since the two partners arrived separately, they each had their own car. As they drove back to the station, each alone, they tried to make sense of the evidence presented to them. Unfortunately, neither of them had the wit to come up with anything better than what they had already discussed. For the rest of the shift, both of them were busy writing reports and other paperwork. No new information came from the lab before they left for home, so they were left to mull over what they had already learned that day. The next morning, Peter and Dave arrived half an hour early. It was obvious that the Mark Evans case was high on their agenda. Fortunately, their dedication to their work was rewarded. They were greeted by a stack of reports from the forensic office. It took them an hour to read through the reports, passing them to each other as they digested the information they had received. Once they were done with what awaited them, they both realized there were more reports ahead of them. Looking over one of the reports, Peter Nesbitt said to his partner, "They seem to be pointing in the same direction, don't they? But it looks like there are more reports waiting for us this morning, so I don't think we should hurry. Wouldn't want to let things go to waste." David Klein nodded, looking at his partner, and replied, "I think you're right. Let's see if they can get anything else out of the computer. In the meantime, we can go and talk to his lawyer and some of the people he worked with. I'm not sure we have enough probable cause to arrest him yet. We need to take some formal statements before we talk to the DA." Both men were in complete agreement with each other and went to the office of attorney Mark Evans just after 9 in the morning. Like all attorneys, Robert Graham did not want to appear biased against the police, especially during the investigation. He rushed to give them a few minutes of his time. "You do realize that I can't discuss anything pertaining to my client's legal situation, right? So let's hear what you want from me so I can decide whether or not to answer your questions. The lawyer leaned back in his chair and waited. Detective Nesbitt spoke quickly, not wanting to waste the attorney's valuable time. We have several emails here that we obtained under a search warrant from Mark Evans's computer. Could you please confirm their receipt? We just need to know that these emails were actually sent to you in the last couple weeks. We want to be sure they're not just rough copies. He held out 4 pieces of paper to the lawyer. The lawyer quickly looked over each one and then replied, "It looks like they are indeed originals. I can confirm receipt of each of them." He handed them back to the detective, who immediately stood up and said, "Thank you, Mr. Graham. That's all we need. We can't make investigative decisions based on what these letters tell us without some sort of confirmation of their authenticity." The 2 detectives walked out of the office exchanging smiles and headed for their car. As they drove to ABC Industrial, Peter Nesbitt said to his partner, "Like you said yesterday, situations like this usually involve the spouse. However, we have a few more bridges to cross." When they arrived at Mark Evans's place of employment, both detectives were quickly ushered into the office of his immediate superior. This time, it was Detective Klein who did the talking. "We're investigating yesterday's discovery of an automobile in George Washington Park. You probably read about it in this morning's paper. The car belonged to one of your employees, Mark Evans. We have a few questions you might be able to help us with." Mark's boss quickly assured them that he would do his best to help them. He said that Mark was considered a very valuable employee, and anything that could be done to solve the mystery of his abandoned car would be perfectly acceptable. "First, I would like to know if Mark will remain in Pittsburgh until Friday night. Rumor has it that he has seminars scheduled for Saturday and Sunday. We need to know if that's true." His boss quickly replied, "Mark definitely didn't have any events scheduled for the weekend. I fully expected him to be back Friday night." Detective Klein nodded, made a note in his notebook, and continued, "Have you noticed anything about Mark that struck you as a little odd lately? We think maybe he has something on his mind, something that stands out." The man sitting at the table thought for a moment, then replied, "Mark seems to be carrying more on his shoulders lately. I asked him a couple weeks ago if he was having any problems. At that time, he replied that everything was fine. I also noticed that he had become thoughtful. I assumed he was working hard to solve our problems, but I think he may have other concerns." The detectives thanked him and then quickly headed to their car. A picture was emerging, and both knew that by the end of the day there was every chance of making significant progress on the case. By late morning, they returned to the office and found that the preliminary DNA results were in. There was also a strange-looking box on the desk with wires dangling from it, and a forensic report on top. Both detectives found this particularly interesting, especially when combined with the printed maps the computer technician had given them. Another gap had been filled, and the picture was becoming clearer and clearer. Taking the accumulated information, printouts, and notepads, they went to spend a couple hours in one of the empty interrogation rooms. By the time they came out of there, they thought they had a pretty good understanding of what had happened in the park, although there were still some very large gaps in the matter. They decided it was time to pay another visit to Lisa Evans. This time they felt they had enough information to ask her some tough questions. Depending on the answers they got, there might be a reason to call her in for an official statement. The detectives arrived at Evans's house a little after 3 in the afternoon. They did not call ahead, fearing that she would have time to prepare for their arrival. They wanted to take her by surprise. They walked up to the front door and rang the doorbell as any normal visitor would. Lisa Evans looked more than astonished when she saw the 2 of them standing at the door. "Detectives, did you find my husband? I call the sergeant every 2 hours and he keeps saying I have nothing to report." Detective Nesbitt replied, "No, we haven't found your husband yet. However, we have made some progress. We would like to come in and ask you a few questions if you don't mind." Lisa Evans looked a little embarrassed, but then stepped back and said, "Sure, come in. I'll do my best to help you find Mark." She walked into the living room and the 2 men followed her. When she sat down on the couch, each of the detectives took a seat in one of the chairs across from her. Detective Klein, opening his notebook, began the conversation by asking, "Is there anything you want to tell us about your relationship with Blake Moore?" Both detectives decided that such a question, asked head-on, might cause Lisa Evans to reveal something she might prefer to keep hidden. This decision was immediately confirmed when Lisa Evans quickly turned white and said, What? What do you mean about my relationship with Blake? He's my husband's best friend. He's always hanging out with Mark, but he's just my friend. Her eyes darted back and forth between the two detectives. Now Detective Nesbitt joined them. Are you having an affair with Blake Moore or not? The detective had asked the question calmly and evenly, and now sat waiting for an answer. It was unlikely, but both detectives later agreed that when she was asked again, she seemed to grow even paler. Her mouth silently opened and closed several times before she said, Absolutely not. How can you come here and ask me questions like that? Both detectives immediately stood up, and Detective Klein said, I think you're going to have to proceed to the station. We're going to take a formal statement from you. Lisa clearly began to panic. What? Am I under arrest? Why do I have to go to the station with you? You're not under arrest yet. We have reason to believe that you have not been forthright with us, and we want an official statement from you. You'll be able to ask for a lawyer if you need one. Lisa frantically shifted her gaze from one detective to the other and quickly replied, I don't need a lawyer. I haven't done anything. If you want me to come to the station and answer your questions, fine. I'll come. I will do whatever it takes to help you find my Mark. Lisa Evans got up quickly to escort the detectives to their car for the trip downtown. She was walking ahead of them, so she didn't notice Pete giving Dave the thumbs-up sign. After placing her in the back seat, the two men took their seats in front and drove back to the police station in silence. Arriving at the station, the detectives slowly led Lisa Evans upstairs to an interrogation room and then into one of the empty interrogation rooms. They chose the darkest room they could find. It needed to be repainted and new furniture put in. They wanted to create as negative an environment as possible. Say that. We'll ask you to wait here for a few minutes while we gather the documents. Are you sure you don't want to talk to a lawyer? Detective Nesbitt was giving her every opportunity to decide, but this time she refused, shaking her head quickly. She still looked very beautiful against the dreary surroundings, though her blue eyes were full of tears. She sank heavily into one of the chairs and the detective left the room, closing the door behind him. Make sure both cameras are on the entire time we're with her. I need a good recording of everything that's going to be said in there. I have a feeling we're going to solve this case, and I don't want to miss a word she says. Detective Klein was talking to his commanding officer, the man who would record and personally testify to what was said in the interrogation room. At this time, Peter Nesbitt came up with a backlog of cases. He was contemplating the upcoming interrogation of Lisa Evans and said, Let's have coffee first. Let her have time to think. Everyone quickly agreed and the three men left to spend the next 20 minutes in the staff coffee shop discussing the case and how they would handle her interrogation. Life does not flow in a single linear rhythm. Countless events occur in overlapping timelines. While the two detectives were talking to Mark Evans' manager that morning, on the other side of the town, a volunteer answered the phone at Crime Stoppers. Good morning. This is your local Crime Stoppers office. We pay up to $1,000 cash for good tips on solved crimes. How can you help us fight crime? Please be advised that this call is being recorded. There was no answer for a few seconds, and the volunteer sitting at the phone figured there was no one there, but before she hung up, an older man said, Huh, is this the place where I can get money if I help the police? Well, sir, it depends on what you tell us, the type of crime and how much the police think you contributed to solving it. Do you have any information about the crime? There was silence again for a few moments before the caller spoke. So now I don't get the money? I'll have to wait? What if the cops want to trick me out of the money? What then, huh? Well, sir, we need to know for sure that you helped. The money isn't coming from the police, so they have no reason to try to scam you, sir. Tell me what you know, and I'll give you the code number for later. Call me back in a few days, and I'll tell you if the information helped you and how much it will cost. The man got a little indignant. I need the juice now. I need the money now. Well, sir, so be it. What do you mean you need juice? If you're homeless and need food, I can give you the addresses of several shelters where you can eat. I don't need any damn food, I need juice. You know, grape juice that sells for $5 a bottle. The woman grinned to herself, but said to the man, I'm afraid I can't help you now. But if you have good information, you could probably afford many bottles of grape juice. Okay, I'll wait. I saw someone throw a gun. Into the river? I was under the 3rd Street Bridge, just minding my own business on a Sunday morning. At least I think it was a Sunday morning, when some guy drove up to the public access point. When he got out of his car, he had a shotgun and 2 shovels in his hands. He threw it all into the river right in front of me. I was horrified, let me tell you. I was sure he was going to see me and shoot me with the gun. The cameraman was mildly interested in what the old man had told her, and she asked, "Was it in the parking lot on the east side of the 3rd Street Bridge? Did he throw them in the water?" "Yes, that's the place, but no, he just threw them over the end of that little dock. They shouldn't have any trouble finding the guns." He hesitated before adding, "I can describe him too. He was large, with blonde hair. Not blonde, just blonde. And his car. It was dark blue. License plate started with AZSS, and I forget the rest. Jimmy came over with juice and shared it with us, so I forgot part of it. But the rest of it was correct. I lived in Arizona, and at one time I had a Chevy Impala SS. That's how I remember it." The woman had written down all the information and was now ready to end the conversation. "Well, sir, I think I have everything we need. Now I'm going to give you a number for you to memorize. The number is 127. Call me back in a few days and tell me you're calling about tip number 127, and I'll tell you if it helped the police. We might even find out how much the information is worth. If it's worth money, we'll tell you where you can pick it up anonymously." The call ended quickly, and the Crime Stoppers operator relayed the information to the police officer she was reporting to. The latter decided he would send a diver out as soon as possible, since getting guns off the streets was one of the mayor's top priorities. As it turned out, the police diver arrived on the scene no more than an hour later, and it took him only a few minutes to find 3 items thrown into the river. Reports were made, which were then passed to Crime Stoppers. By 2:30, the shovels were at the property clerk's office, and the gun was turned over to the crime lab to see if it matched any unsolved crimes in the city. When the gun was turned into the lab, it was quickly discovered that the caliber and type of ammunition in the jacket matched perfectly with a recent crime scene in George Washington Park. Within minutes, the gun was examined in detail, and a test bullet was fired for comparison. It was immediately apparent that it matched a bullet recovered from a bundle of firewood found in the park. The report was immediately sent upstairs to the detectives handling the case, and the technician went to retrieve 2 shovels from the property clerk. Different chains of events can run parallel, but they can also intersect, and that's exactly what happened when the detectives and their commanding officer walked out of the staff cafe. They were met outside the door by the clerk who was delivering the ballistics and Crime Stoppers reports. "Detectives, I was just bringing you this information. We have the gun that was used in the George Washington Park shooting. The attached Crime Stoppers report also has some information for you. It might even lead you directly to the perpetrator." The smirking crime lab employee handed both reports to the surprised detectives and headed back to his department. Detectives Klein and Nesbitt took turns reviewing both reports. Within seconds, they were already sitting side by side in front of a computer terminal, calling up records from the Motor Vehicle Registration Department. When they were finished, a brief conversation ensued between them. "Pete, I'd like to suggest we split up. If you want, I'll start questioning our guest in the interrogation room, and you can take a uniformed officer and go get Mr. Moore. He needs to be brought here for questioning too." "Sounds like a plan, Dave. It's working out just fine, isn't it?" Detective Klein picked up the backlog of reports and information and headed for the interview room, where Lisa Evans continued to wait for him. Meanwhile, his partner was talking to his commanding officer, asking him to help a uniformed officer pay a surprise visit to Blake Moore. Soon, he was on his way out the door and a patrol car was to meet him at Moore's house. When Detective Klein entered the interview room, Lisa Evans sat calmly at the table, her face expressing neither sadness nor fear. She seemed to be stoically awaiting her fate, whatever it might be. "I'm sorry to keep you waiting, Mrs. Evans. I'm ready to get to work. Please be aware that this room is monitored by 2 video cameras, and everything we say and do is being recorded." She looked at him with some surprise and replied, "I don't mind if you record us. I have nothing to hide." Shuffling the papers, he replied, "That's good. Then we can begin." Leaning back in his chair, he cast a brief glance at her before getting down to business. "I'll start where we left off in our conversation at your home. I'll say it again. Are you having an affair with Blake Moore? Yes or no?" His decision to get to the heart of the matter again had a noticeable effect on her. Her shoulders slumped slightly and she turned her head so that she would no longer meet the detective's gaze. After a few seconds, she said in a quiet voice, "Yes?" Detective Klein tore a few pages from the stack of papers in front of him. "It's good that you've decided to be straight with me. We have evidence of your affair, printed from your husband's laptop." His statement seemed to shock her. She raised her head and looked him straight in the eye again. "What do you mean you have proof? No one knew about Blake and me." "Your husband certainly knew, as you can see in these pages. Here is the letter he sent to his attorney almost a month ago, telling him he wanted him to start preparing the papers for a divorce on the grounds of adultery. Here is a map from 2 weeks ago that clearly shows the route you took that day, with timestamps indicating that you spent 2 hours at Blake Moore's house. Here's a copy of the email your husband sent to his attorney that day, describing how you lied when he called you in the afternoon and told you you were home." One by one, the sheets of paper slid across the desk and lay down in front of the seated woman. She looked over the papers and the detective several times, then took each one in her hands and made sure that each one depicted exactly what the detective was talking about. Finally, she spoke. How did Mark do this? How could he know where I am? This map." She picked up the detailed map and traced the route that was clearly marked on it, showing how she had gotten from her house to her lover's house. "I don't know how your husband found out about this, but something made him install this device in your car." He picked up a small black device, smaller than a pack of cigarettes, and held it out to her. The name PT-200 was embossed on the side, and underneath it was the name Rocky Mountain Tracking. He bought it online along with the unlimited tracking option and could use his laptop to get a complete real-time history of your whereabouts, with full addresses, dates, and times. He could tell you where your car was every minute of every day since he installed that device under the dashboard. She stared at the small, innocent-looking electronic device as if it were a scorpion ready to sting her. "So Mark has known about us for weeks now? Oh my God. And he wanted a divorce." She began to cry again, and the detective turned away for a moment to pick up the papers and tracking device he'd stacked in a separate pile beside him. Of course, he included the times and locations of all 4 of your conversations with his friend over the last month on the map. The last map was created just after midnight on Saturday, the night he went missing. Around the same time, he sent an email to his attorney saying he was going to drive to Moore's and confront the 2 of you. He told his lawyer that he was afraid he would be arrested if he broke into the house or got into a fight with your lover, his supposed friend. She looked at the detective again and said, But he never went there. I spent the night there, but Mark never showed up. Something must have happened to him before he got to Blake's house." And now the detective seemed to be well prepared for this statement, for he quickly said, "I'm sure something happened to him, that's correct. Preliminary DNA results confirm that the blood in the park is his, and we just found the gun that was used. We can link the gun to your lover, and now the only question is how long you're going to hide it." Blake didn't do anything to Mark. I was with him the whole time and he didn't leave that night." Her eyes turned to the detective again as she continued, "We were together all night in his bed." The detective pulled a few more pages from his stack and said, "We have more. The blood in your car and on your shoes, I might add, also belongs to your husband. My partner is on his way to pick up Mr. Moore now, and we'll soon find out if his story matches yours. There is such a thing as prosecutorial discretion. Whichever one of you two tells us what really happened and where we can find your husband's body will get a better offer at sentencing." He handed her the blood test reports across the table, but she barely glanced at them. "Mark isn't dead. He can't be dead. I love him. I need him." She sobbed again and was clearly very upset. "Blake will tell you the same thing I did. If my husband got hurt in the park, we had nothing to do with it." She continued to hide her face with her hands as she cried. She had a crumpled and very wet handkerchief in her left hand. Detective Klein gave her a few minutes to recover, and in the meantime he took up again the reports lying before her and selected a few more with which he intended to shock her when she came to her senses. When she seemed to come to her senses a little, he said, "There is no doubt that your husband is dead. The medical examiner has thoroughly examined the scene and has concluded that, based on the blood loss and the fact that your husband was not treated at any medical facility in the county, there is a greater than 95% chance that he is dead." He handed her across the table the appropriate report and several 8x10 photos of the scene. One of the photos touched her elbow, and she took her hands away from her face to look at it. It seemed to her that every square inch of the photograph showed blood, though it was actually somewhat smaller. She immediately burst into tears again, and the detective checked his documentation once more before gathering everything into a pile, picking her up in his arms and heading for the door. "I'm going to leave you alone for a few minutes so you can come to your senses. You're not doing yourself any good by not taking responsibility for what happened." Detective Klein placed the stack of evidentiary reports on his desk, shook his head as he walked past his commanding officer, and headed to the break room for a fresh cup of coffee. His commander continued to glance periodically at the monitor that displayed the interior of the interrogation room and made sure the female detainee remained unharmed. As he left the station, Detective Nesbitt immersed himself in his thoughts about the Mark Evans case. Apparently, they had gotten enough information from the forensics department to solve it soon. He also pondered whether Blake Moore was still in town. If he had any idea how much evidence the department already had, he'd probably be tempted to run away from their jurisdiction. He pulled up to Moore's house almost at the same time as the patrol car that was to accompany him. The two policemen knew each other and exchanged pleasantries as they headed for the front door. Detective Nesbitt was almost surprised when their knock was quickly answered by Blake Moore. The man looked curiously at the two strangers standing at his door, one dressed in a police uniform and the other holding a badge and identification. "Yes, officers. What can I do for you?" The detective quickly replied, "I'm Detective Nesbitt, and I'm here about the disappearance of Mark Evans. We'd like you to join us at the station for questioning. We have Mrs. Evans there right now, and questions have arisen that will require your participation." The tall, well-built, and rough-looking man quickly asked, "Am I under arrest? I know that Mark is missing, as I have spoken to his wife. However, I'm not quite sure what you think I can tell you about that. We have a few questions that we think you might be able to help us with. If you don't mind, we'd like you to come with us even though you're not under arrest." Blake Moore seemed too stunned to offer any real resistance to their request and quickly joined them, heading toward the unmarked car driven by Detective Nesbitt. Once there, he calmly accepted their invitation to sit in the back seat and was not at all surprised that both the detective and the uniformed officer sat in the front seat. Department protocol requires that when dealing with a potentially violent suspect, two police officers be on hand for backup. The detective turned to his uniformed partner first. "We'll have one of the patrol cars take you to a patrol car later." When the formalities were over, Detective Nesbitt turned to Blake Moore and asked, "Tell me, Mr. Moore, how well do you know Mrs. Evans?" Their passenger quickly replied, "She's just Mark's wife to me. I've known her since he met her. Why do you ask?" "Just wondering, sir. What do you do anyway, Mr. Moore?" Blake Moore seemed to relax a little when the question was asked and replied, "I have a small landscaping company, Moore's Landscaping. We do a lot of commercial work. You've probably seen some of them, as we've even done work for the city." Their conversation continued until they arrived at the police station, where Blake Moore was escorted to an interrogation room adjacent to the one where Lisa Evans was being held. He, too, was asked to wait alone while the detective gathered up the folders that Detective Klein had placed on his desk a few minutes ago. A couple minutes later, a conversation had already begun between Blake Moore and Detective Nesbitt that was entirely consistent with the interrogation of Lisa Evans that had just ended. At first, he denied that he was having an affair with Lisa Evans, but emails and surveillance reports soon had him changing his viewpoint. He quickly admitted that they had an affair that lasted almost 4 months. He adamantly denied that they had done anything to Mark Evans and insisted that neither of them had left his home the night Lisa's husband disappeared. As Detective Nesbitt continued to press the suspect, categorically denying his involvement in Mark Evans's disappearance, a new theory about what happened in the park emerged. "I had nothing to do with anything that happened in that park. If Mark had found out about Lisa and I, he probably would have gone into a rage, and there's no telling what he might have done. He might even have hired his own killer and paid him to make it look like Lisa and I were involved. He and I had a history of things, like my relationship with Lisa." "What do you mean, Mr. Moore?" "We have the gun that was used, and the witness described you and your car and stated that you were responsible for throwing the gun in the river. He even gave almost the complete license plate number of your car. Don't try to make up a fairy tale that Mark Evans committed an elaborate suicide to frame you and his wife." Blake Moore became very agitated and replied, "You don't know Mark. He and I have been best friends since elementary school, but I learned a long time ago that it was best not to get involved with his girlfriends and now his wife. We were seniors in high school, and one day I did. I took out one of his girlfriends behind his back, and when he found out I was having fun with her while they were dating, he got so mad he scared me. I'm much bigger than him and have always been stronger, but he scared me. He warned me that he couldn't take it anymore and that I would be a dead man." The detective listened to this statement with faint amusement on his face. "So you're saying that you were actually afraid of what he would do if he found out, but you had fun with his wife anyway? That doesn't make any sense." Blake already replied more calmly. "Silly, isn't it? I just couldn't resist her. Over the years, the sympathy between us gradually grew, and finally a few months ago I made a serious move on her. We've been seeing each other periodically ever since. I can't imagine how he could have guessed. We were so careful." The detective looked through the stack of reports before continuing. "Yeah, it was stupid. Sometimes I think half of our murders and suicides involve stupidity like that. The old eternal triangle. The only thing is, in this case, I think you and Lisa are the perpetrators. You can tell us what happened. Did he catch you off guard and things got out of hand? Or maybe you planned the whole thing from the beginning so you could be together and not worry about him finding out. I don't believe he organized his own murder. It's too weird. He already had a lawyer handling his divorce, so why would he suddenly resort to that? I don't know what happened. All I know is that Lisa and I had nothing to do with it. As for wanting to be together, that was out of our hands. Both she and I knew it was just a fling and it wouldn't last. As they say, the rose had already bloomed." Detective Nesbitt leaned forward and said, "We have enough probable cause to get a search warrant for your home, car, and office. I wouldn't be surprised if that's already happening. You'd better come clean before we put the final nail in your coffin. I'm going to make you the same offer I'm sure my partner made to your lover. First, tell us what happened and we'll reduce your sentence. There is no point in keeping your mouth shut and getting the maximum. Use your head and do yourself a favor." Blake Moore was outraged. "I had nothing to do with what happened to Mark. Maybe Lisa organized something herself, but if that's the case, I don't know anything about it." The detective picked up his papers, never answering the suspect's latest theory. Leaving the room, he said, "It's understandable. When two criminals work together, one always tries to pin the blame on the other. You can relax a little because I don't think you're going to be leaving anytime soon." Exiting the interview room, Detective Nesbitt found his partner waiting for him with another report in hand. "It's getting better and better. The two shovels found in the river are stamped that they belong to Moore's Landscaping. Wow, why do these guys always think we'll never find out what happened?" A few minutes later, the two detectives were explaining to the district attorney what evidence they had collected. Even though they didn't have a body and the evidence was somewhat circumstantial, it didn't take them long to convince him that there was enough evidence to bring charges. Half an hour later, Lisa Evans and Blake Moore were charged with the murder of Mark Evans. Both loudly proclaimed their innocence while their Miranda rights were read to them, but were told that everything was now in the hands of the prosecution and the court system. This information did not reassure either of them. After the arraignment, Lisa and Blake were escorted to the main floor of the police station where they were fingerprinted and photographed under a sequential number. The instruction not to smile for the photos was completely unnecessary, as Blake was frowning angrily the whole time and Lisa could hardly cry and smile at the same time. As they were led back to their neighboring cells, they had their first chance to talk to each other since the arraignment. "What are we going to do, Blake? They're not going to believe we did anything to Mark, are they?" Lisa still snorted occasionally, but it was mostly gone. "I guess we'll have to hire our own lawyers, unless you want to share one with me. It might be cheaper, and since we're both being accused of the same thing, it makes a certain amount of sense. But this whole damn situation is completely wrong. I just know Mark did something to set us up. I think the bastard paid someone to take him out and then left a trail of breadcrumbs for the cops to charge us." Mark was obviously still very angry. "You can't believe he could do that, can you?" Lisa was showing shock, bordering on outrage, at such an assumption. "Why would Mark go to such a monstrous extreme as murder? I don't think you knew your husband as well as you think you did, Lisa. I'm just surprised he didn't do something drastic to the two of us the same day he found out about our affair. It's a real mystery to me. I've known Mark for too many years to think he would put up with this for so long. If I thought for one second that he would somehow find out about us, I wouldn't lay a finger on you for anything in the world. He then proceeded to tell her about what had happened years ago when he had pranked his girlfriend behind Mark's back. They were now in their cells, separated by a 6-inch concrete wall, but could talk freely to each other standing at the bars leaning against the block wall. I don't believe Mark is capable of such a thing. I also don't know how or when he found out. I've never noticed him treating me any differently. Most of the times we met, he was out of town, and we never went out in public together. The couple times we did meet when he was actually in town, and that was at that little motel on the north side of town, Lisa replied. After thinking for a bit, she continued, I shouldn't have betrayed him. Even if he's not dead, he'll still want a divorce. Her voice trailed off several times on the last sentence as she was clearly agitated again. Blake managed to listen to a few sobs before he spoke. God, Lisa, stop it. You must have imagined how it would end if he ever caught us together. The first time you came to my house and found yourself with your legs spread in the middle of my bed, your eyes were open. His words had the desired effect and her sniffling stopped. After a few seconds, she said in a very quiet voice, You're right. I can only hope he will forgive me. They were silent for a couple more minutes before Lisa suggested, I could call Robert Graham. He was our attorney, and if he represents both of us, we can split the costs. They agreed to this legal solution, and a few minutes later, when she managed to get the attention of a passing officer, she was escorted to a small private room with a telephone and a phone book for her use. The call to Robert Graham was not as easy as she had expected. He informed her that since he was already Mark's attorney in the divorce proceedings, he would not be comfortable representing her. He suggested that one of his colleagues, Basil Smith, a lawyer with extensive experience in criminal cases, would be a good fit as their attorney. She quickly agreed, and it was arranged that the new attorney would come to them immediately for a consultation. Blake was pleased to hear that the attorney was on his way and thanked her for calling. Both sat down on a wooden bench attached to the back wall of their enclosures and spent the next hour waiting, indulging in their own personal reflections. When Basil Smith arrived, they were both escorted to a small room designated for meeting with attorneys. Basil Smith was not a bad lawyer. Short, stocky, with a mop of dark hair fringing his bald head. At least he didn't believe in that awful hairstyle. A dark blue pinstripe suit completed the image of a 50-year-old legal professional. The introductions were quick, and the two nervous prisoners waited while he carefully scanned the copies of the documents detailing the charges against them that he'd been handed upon arrival. Once finished with that, he raised his head to look at his two new clients in turn and said, So, you're both charged with the murder of Mark Evans. What can you tell me about what the arresting officers told you both? You first, Mrs. Evans. Just the big picture, please. I just want to have an idea of what we have. Lisa began to recount in abbreviated form what had happened since Detective Nesbitt had met her at the driveway on Sunday afternoon. When she started talking about the fingerprints and the sketchbook, her tears came again. In between sobs, she ended her statement by saying, I had nothing to do with what happened in that park. I love Mark. I couldn't hurt him. Basil Smith thought about her words for a moment, then turned to Blake and said, You turned around. I don't need all those little details. Blake Moore briefly recounted what had happened since the police arrived at his home that day, and his story was far from tearful. He ended his story by saying, Lisa and I had nothing to do with Mark's disappearance or what happened in the park. I told Lisa and the police officers the same thing, and now I'm going to tell you. Mark Evans somehow orchestrated this. I believe he paid to have it taken out, and part of the deal was that whoever did the job agreed to frame Lisa and me. He glared at the lawyer, as if challenging him to disagree with his explanation. When Blake repeated his certainty that Mark was dead, Lisa began sobbing again. The lawyer cast a brief glance at her, then said, Now is not the time to prove each other right. First of all, we need to think about what we can do to get you both out of here. We need to consider your bail. From what you both have told me, and from what I see in this set of charges, I believe they will ask for bail of about $100,000 for each of you. Will bail be a problem? Lisa looked shocked and asked, Will I need $100,000 for bail? She was ready to panic, knowing she didn't have anywhere near that amount in assets. No, Lisa. You will only need 10% or $10,000 cash to post a $100,000 bail bond. You are not required to post the full amount in this state unless required by the judge, the attorney was quick to tell her. After explaining this, they decided that neither of them would have any difficulty in posting bail, and naturally, they were very much interested in whether they could get out on bail immediately. You will be arraigned tomorrow morning and bail will be set. At that time, you will also be able to make the necessary arrangements to get out of here. Both of you will be spending the night here, so get used to the idea. Both of his clients reacted badly to this statement. And the lawyer informed them that there was nothing more he could do until charges were filed. Once the task of getting them out of their cells was accomplished, he would try to talk to the district attorney to get him to announce the evidence. It seemed to him that he would understand their situation better if he knew what facts they were dealing with. They were both taken back to their cells where neither of them slept that night. They were given greasy takeout food for dinner, one blanket per night, and loud cellmates in the middle of the night. None of them looked particularly fit when they met with their attorney at 10 o'clock the next morning before their first court hearing. None of the court staff, not even the judge, seemed particularly concerned about their appearance as their pleas of not guilty were accepted, and bail was set at the expected $100,000. Since Blake had both a home and a business, he was able to quickly negotiate a $10,000 bond with the court and was back on the street by early afternoon. Lisa, however, was less fortunate. Unlike Blake, she did not have sole ownership of their home, so bail was out of the question. To her shock, she discovered that the savings account she expected to have more than $20,000 in it was now empty. Without them, she could not get the required deposit, and in desperation, she called her parents. Explaining to her parents the need for the deposit was one of the most difficult tasks she had ever had to undertake. Only after much persuasion on her part did they finally agree to reimburse the court for the missing $10,000. By the time Lisa had secured her parents' help, it was too late to do the paperwork, and she spent a second night in a cell. This time, her cellmates were several tipsy prostitutes. She spent most of the night without sleep, hunched in a corner, covered by a single blanket. By noon the next day, with all financial matters settled, she was finally allowed to leave the station and return to her empty house. She immediately showered, went to bed, and ignored several phone calls, leaving the answering machine to deal with them on its own. The next month went by rather quickly for both defendants. In the first few days, Lisa learned that the money missing from her and her husband's joint bank account had been withdrawn by him about 10 days before her disappearance. Her attorney discovered that an email had been sent to his partner, Robert Graham, in which Mark explained that he was withdrawing the money from the account in cash so that his wife would not lose her legal share when she filed for divorce. There was no indication of what he did with the cash, although his email stated that he would give up his share once an appropriate agreement was reached with Lisa on the terms of their divorce. Lisa and Blake met with Basil Smith on several occasions, during which he informed them that he had met with the district attorney, had received copies of various reports and summaries of evidence, and planned to bring his clients to meet with the district attorney in hopes of getting all charges dismissed. He believed that the absence of a body or witness for cross-examination would make it very difficult to obtain a conviction. Shortly after posting bail during their first meeting, he suggested that they hire a private investigator to try to determine if there was a way to prove that Mark himself contributed to his death or disappearance. Blake happily agreed, although Lisa still didn't believe that Mark could have had anything to do with what had happened. She put forward the theory that Mark had been the victim of a botched carjacking. In her opinion, it made as much sense as Blake's theory. But even if she did suggest a carjacking, she still didn't want to admit that all signs pointed to Mark no longer being alive. Over the next few weeks, they received regular reports from the hired detective, but they were all very similar. He wasn't finding anything. Basil Smith also suggested that the detective try to find the old winemaker who had reported the discarded shotgun and shovels. Basil got a copy of the Criminal Information Service recording of the call, and the detective used it, combing the neighborhoods favored by down-and-out people. None of his interlocutors recognized the voice, and it also seems strange that the tipster never called to see if tip number 127 would help him stay off the juice for a while. I had to allow for the possibility that the caller simply forgot the number or maybe forgot that he had reported the tip. Also, this population was very mobile and moved from one neighborhood to another depending on factors such as weather, police availability, and sources of quick cash. Although he never talked about it, Basil Smith began to notice that his two clients didn't seem to get along with each other anymore. Neither of them had told him this voluntarily, but shortly after his bail, Blake had suggested to Lisa that since Mark was now off the case, they could meet as often as they wanted at either of their homes. Her response was swift and decisive. "I want nothing to do with you except our court case. You kept pushing and pushing me, and like a fool I gave in. Now I've lost Mark." Her reply ended with another fit of tears, which she seemed to repeat often almost without provocation. Blake's reply was succinct and definitive. "Suit yourself, Lisa. You're not the only woman in town." They had not spoken since, except in the company of their lawyer, where a continued feud would have been disadvantageous to both of them. The ashes of their illicit affair were now icy cold. A little over a month after his release, Basil Smith arranged a meeting with District Attorney Jeff Bagden, which they were all to attend. Lisa and Blake went to the meeting hoping the charges would be dropped. They were constantly pestered with calls and inquiries from friends and acquaintances about the nature of their relationship. They both began screening the calls with caller ID and answering machines. Clearing the charges would allow them to move on with their lives. Lisa and Blake were surprised at how young, stylish, and casual Jeff Bagden looked. He could pass for their lawyer's son, except he had a full mop of dark hair. The district attorney spoke as soon as all four of them were seated in their chairs. "I'm glad we were able to meet so easily. I just received the final report from the medical examiner today, and the police and medical examiner's reports are in. I have carefully reviewed all the evidence, and I believe I am serving the people by offering you a reduced sentence of 8 to 12 years for agreeing to plead guilty to second-degree murder." The faces of the two defendants and, to some extent, their attorney reflected shock and awe. Lisa and Blake began loudly proclaiming their innocence, while their attorney alternately tried to silence them and asked the district attorney how he could justify the offer. When everyone was silent, Jeff Bagden began, "Since the first charges were filed, I have received new reports and information. I will provide Mr. Smith with copies of the new information right away. The first is the DNA report of the blood samples taken from the back of the license plate and from the rubber gasket on the trunk lid of your car, Mr. Moore. Both samples contained Mark Evans's DNA. The samples were taken pursuant to a search warrant before you posted bail. In addition, the scrap of black polyethylene found under the rear tire of Mark Evans's car matches the make and style used in your landscaping business." At this point, the prosecutor fell silent, deciding to observe the reactions of the two defendants. Lisa looked more angry than shocked. While Blake still seemed to be digesting the implications of the facts the prosecutor had just laid out, Lisa interjected into the conversation. "Blake, what have you done?" She seemed ready to continue her accusations, but Basil Smith immediately managed to insist on her silence. Blake reacted very quickly to her accusations. He exploded, "You know perfectly well that I had nothing to do with it. You were beside me, in my bed, when it happened." That was all he had time to say before Basil grabbed his arm and explicitly told him to shut up. The attorney's next words were intended for the district attorney. "Please excuse my clients, Jeff. We came here hoping the charges would be dropped, and your statement caught them both off guard." Jeff Bagden seemed mildly amused by the spectacle the two defendants made. "I understand, Basil. I was in private practice, but the fact remains that we have more than enough evidence to bring this case to trial. The medical examiner's report clearly states that the victim lost too much blood to stay alive, and the crime scene reports can be interpreted to mean that the body was dragged away from the scene and loaded into a car. I'm comfortable with this case from the prosecution's point of view." The district attorney stood up, pulled a folder of reports from his briefcase, handed them to Basil Smith, and promptly left the room. As soon as the door closed behind the departing DA, Lisa and Blake began talking hurriedly to their attorney. He couldn't make either of them out and had to ask both of them to shut up. The fact that their own attorney asked them to be quiet was surprising enough that both complied. "I know you're both shocked and upset by this turn of events. I didn't expect it either. You shouldn't be fighting with each other over the situation you find yourselves in. We should try to figure out how we can handle this so you both don't go to jail. I take it you both want to reject his offer of 8 to 12 years. Both of his clients hurriedly flatly refused the proposed deal. Both were confident that they would not be charged with anything at trial. Deciding that he would refuse the offer on their behalf, Basil Smith let both of them go, saying that he would have a lot of work to do in preparation for the trial. With both clients gone, Basil was left alone in the room, and after quickly reviewing the new reports, he sat back, wondering if either of his clients were telling the truth. Technically, it didn't matter. He would protect them regardless of the state of their souls. He just liked it better when he was sure his clients were telling him the truth. Several months passed, and the trial of Lisa Evans and Blake Moore was about to begin. At 10 a.m. on Monday morning, with everyone in the courtroom standing, Judge Robert Cox took his seat. The defense table was arranged so that Basil Smith sat between two of his clients. He decided that was the best way to handle the fact that they could hardly be polite to each other. He'd already considered suggesting that they each hire their own lawyer. It would be more of a reminder than anything else to keep them apart, but realized that they probably wouldn't be able to afford the legal fees individually. He knew that Blake Moore's business had fallen on hard times and that Lisa Evans had recently quit her job due to the stress of the upcoming trial and the difficulty in communicating with her missing husband's friends and acquaintances. District Attorney Jeff Bagdon's opening statement was the first important moment, and he got right to the point. Members of the jury, I'm going to be frank with you. We do not have the body of the victim in this case, Mark Evans. However, we intend to prove to you that he is dead and that both defendants are without a doubt guilty of his murder. He began slowly, revealing that several months before the murder, both defendants had begun an affair. At some point, Mark Evans found out about it and filed for divorce from his unfaithful wife. Some points remained unknown, such as how and when exactly Mark Evans began to suspect something. According to him, the traces found on Mark Evans's computer proved that he knew when and where the spouses were meeting. There were emails documenting his success in following the two defendants, organizing his finances in the run-up to the divorce, and finally a message showing his intention to meet the two defendants. He continued, "We cannot pinpoint exactly when the three members of this triangle physically came together, but we do know what the results were, and we can show you through photographs and investigation reports exactly what happened. We believe that there was an encounter between the three of them, most likely at Mr. Moore's home, and during that encounter Mr. Evans was incapacitated. He, seated in the passenger seat and probably unconscious, was then driven to a remote area of George Washington Park, less than 1/2 mile from Mr. Moore's home. Once in the park, one of the two defendants shot Mr. Evans in the right upper chest. We do not know if Mr. Evans was conscious at the time of the shot, but he was still sitting in the passenger seat. The evidence shows that he was dragged from his seat and thrown to the ground, hitting one of several pieces of firewood scattered around the picnic area. He was shot again as he lay on the ground. The evidence will show that this bullet grazed his carotid artery, and you'll see graphic photographs of blood indicating the last moments of his life. At this point, Lisa Evans lost her composure, and it was only after several warnings from Judge Cox that her attorney finally managed to get her client under control so that the district attorney could continue her opening statement. The circumstances are dire, as evidenced even by the defendant's reaction. He paused for empty effect before continuing. After Mr. Evans was shot a second time, he was wrapped in a plastic shroud, dragged from the picnic site, and unceremoniously loaded into the trunk of Mr. Moore's car. He was driven to a location unknown to us and buried. Mr. Moore took the murder weapon as well as the shovels used to make Mr. Evans's grave and threw them into the river. We were fortunate that a concerned citizen saw this happen and reported it through Crime Stoppers. Police were able to recover the murder weapon and tools used to kill Mr. Evans. Through expert investigative techniques and accurate forensic analysis, it was possible to prove that both defendants were at the scene of the crime. The blood of the deceased was found on the exterior of Mr. Moore's vehicle, which carried the unfortunate Mr. Evans in the trunk. Lisa Evans may also be implicated in the crime. Her husband's blood was found in her car and on the shoes she wore that day. The defense will argue that the two adulterers were nowhere near the scene of this horrific crime. How will they be able to prove that? By their own testimony, of course. Each of them will claim that the other was with them at the time of the murder and therefore could not have been involved. I am sure that this self-serving testimony will not distract you, the jury, from finding them guilty. Basil Smith found it difficult to object to this statement. He tried, emphasizing that the defendants were innocent until proven guilty, and that there could be no such evidence in such a circumstantial case. He asked the jury to disregard the prosecutor's opening statement and to rely on the evidence that would be presented to them at trial. It was a bold attempt, but several experienced court reporters from local newspapers yielded to the district attorney. The first witness was the department's computer expert, who testified that he had discovered emails and maps illustrating the route Mrs. Evans took to meet with Mr. Moore for illegal purposes. The method that Mark Evans used was described in one of his letters to counsel, and the computer expert explained to the jury how a small electronic device was able to accurately track the defendant's car and then allow her husband to recreate on his computer an accurate time and location map that told him exactly where and when she was meeting with her lover. One reporter took careful notes and planned to include the name Rocky Mountain Tracking in his article. He was sure that more than one husband or wife would be introduced to this company's products because of Mr. Evans' successful use of them. During his testimony, Blake Moore seemed slightly bored, and Lisa Evans looked very embarrassed and did not look at the jury. Basil Smith was unable to get anything out of his cross-examination of this witness. The tracking device was what it was, and the emails he knew could be quickly checked by his own legal partner, Robert Graham. Interrupted for an extended lunch, the trial resumed in the afternoon with testimony from the 911 operator and the two patrolmen who responded to the first call. They simply stated the basic facts surrounding the discovery of Mark Evans' car, and the testimony was devoid of drama. That changed when the detectives who arrived on the scene after the patrol officers reported on the scene began their testimony. The district attorney's description of the scene was corroborated by the medical examiners and medical examiner who arrived on scene. Their descriptions were clinical and accurate, illustrated by large photographs showing bullet holes, blood, and drag marks leading to the paved road. The medical examiner described the amount of blood that he believed was distributed throughout the scene. It was impossible to physically measure its volume because it had been absorbed into the sand and upholstery, but he estimated its volume at 3 to 4 pints, a good percentage of the approximately 10 pints contained in the human body. His most effective testimony, however, concerned 4 separate streams of blood that stretched from the area of the bullet hole in the blood-soaked block of firewood. He testified that they indicated that a major artery had been severed and the force generated by the victim's heart was pushing the flow of blood out of the body. He testified that the length of each of the 4 separate streams was decreasing, indicating that the heart was losing its ability to pump blood. It was when he said that this proved that the victim was in the process of dying that Lisa Evans lost control of her emotions again. She screamed, "No, Mark can't be dead." Lisa burst into uncontrollable tears, and when it became apparent that she would not be able to control her emotions for some time, the judge adjourned the court hearing. The trial was adjourned until 10 a.m. the following morning. The second day of the trial began the same way as the first, at 10 a.m. The medical examiner again took the witness stand, but there was little additional information. He talked mostly about the tests that had been done on the blood samples taken. After 15 minutes, the prosecutor, District Attorney Jeff Bagdon, stopped the questioning and the witness was turned over to the defense attorney. Rising from his seat and taking a few steps toward the witness, defense attorney Basil Smith quickly looked around to make sure his client, Lisa Evans, was in control of her emotions and was not going to disturb the court again as she had the day before. He knew she had been prescribed a sedative, but he was still afraid she might interfere with his cross-examination of the witness. He noted with satisfaction that so far she seemed to be sitting quietly in her seat. He knew that he would have to refute some of the forensic expert's testimony from the day before, for it was very graphic and gave the strong impression that the shooting in the park had been utterly heartless, almost an execution. He began, "You stated that Mark Evans lost between 3 and 4 pints of blood in the park. At the same time, you stated that it was impossible to say exactly because of the conditions and that this was simply your estimate. Isn't it possible that the blood loss could have been between 1 and 2 pints, depending on how the blood was distributed around the site?" The medical examiner, known as a conscientious professional, thought for a few moments before saying, "Unlikely, but not impossible." Basil Smith was silent for almost a minute, giving the jury a chance to realize the medical examiner's admission. Then he continued, "What you described as Mark Evans's fatal injury could have been less fatal if someone had administered first aid immediately. Do you agree?" Again, the medical examiner thought for a moment before answering. My answer is the same as your last question. It is unlikely, but not impossible. Medical attention would likely have been required within minutes of a wound of this nature. There is no evidence that this happened. The defense attorney quickly said, there is no evidence that help was offered, but as you say, it is possible. He dismissed the witness, satisfied that he had secured a few small concessions from him. The next witness was one of the forensic scientists who specialized in guns and ammunition. He testified about the recovery of 2 bullets, one from a seat and one from a deck of firewood. He testified that the ammunition was of a type known as full metal jacket, and that it is often used for target shooting and is a standard for the military. The bullet recovered from the car had struck a metal seat support and was badly deformed, but a second bullet recovered from the firewood was in very good condition. It was not difficult to match it with the weapon found in the river. Basil Smith had done his homework on ballistics, the science of how bullets react to human bodies. He asked, were bullets checked for remnants of bone or flesh through which they passed before being removed? He knew that such a check could even determine which organs of the body the bullet had hit. The technician confirmed that such checks had been done and continued. We found almost nothing on the bullets except traces of blood. The bullet fired into the car seat went through 2 inches of various layers of padding and fabric. We think that may have cleaned it up. It's a similar situation with the second bullet that got lodged in the firewood. The bullets themselves were typically used by the military and had a GMCS, gilding, metal, copper, steel, jacket around the bullet core. This is a copper alloy with a small amount of steel added. He went on to explain that such a jacket is much stronger than a standard all-metal jacket, which is usually composed of copper. This testimony was both good and bad for the defense. He admitted that there was no evidence that the bullets actually passed through the body, but the circumstances and the style of bullet that was used explained the situation. The hope that the gun could be traced was also doomed. The gun was checked against state and national registries, and all that could be found was that it had been sold at a gun show 20 years ago. No record of the buyer survived. The only thing Basil Smith was able to get was confirmation that no fingerprints or DNA from the defendants were found on either the gun or the casings. It turned out that anything that hadn't been washed away by the river water had been wiped off before the gun was disposed of. It was a small confession, but it still felt good to him. Another technician told of testing 2 shovels that had been found. There were no fingerprints or DNA evidence on them, but both shovels were branded Moore's Landscaping. He also testified that, pursuant to the authority granted by the search warrant, he checked Moore's Landscaping and found 14 other shovels with the identical branding. Cross-examination of this witness was inconclusive. The parade of witnesses from the Forensic Science Unit and detectives from the police department continued throughout the morning and afternoon. The only serious cross-examination of Basil Smith occurred when the technician testified about the extraction of blood samples from Blake Moore's car. The technician testified that he found drops of blood behind the license plate, as well as a smear he found on the foam trunk seal. The question quickly arose, could these smears and droplets have been planted by a third party? The technician was forced to admit that it could have been, and Basil Smith returned to the defense table with a smile on his face. Things got a little more complicated when the testimony of the last technician who had been at Lisa Evans's house came into play. Blood was found in the interior of her car, and later more blood was found on the sole of her right shoe. Assuming the blood was planted was more difficult. However, he got the technician to admit that there was no way to determine whether the blood had been transferred from the shoe to the gas pedal or vice versa. The lawyer hoped that the slight doubt caused by this obvious statement would allow the jury to disregard this evidence against Lisa Evans. As the continuous parade of prosecution witnesses gradually waned, the end of the last of the witnesses' testimony coincided with the end of the afternoon session of the trial. As a result, the third morning began with the defense getting a chance to present its evidence. In the evening, the local newspapers continued to print their usual articles about past adultery trials and stories based on court gossip. There were a couple of serious articles about the trial whose authors suggested that it would be very difficult for the defense to counter the body of evidence presented by the prosecution. They also suggested that since there was no body, a conviction would be difficult, especially given the defense's alleged strategy of casting doubt on whether Mark Evans was really dead. Judging from several instances of cross-examination of prosecution witnesses by defense counsel, it was obvious that this was the goal of Basil Smith. As the first defense witness, defense counsel Smith called a recognized expert in blood analysis. His name was Dr. Wilbur, and he had been hired to give expert testimony at many trials. He was quickly asked, "What do you think of the testimony of the medical examiner who talked about the blood evidence in this case?" Dr. Wilbur put on his glasses and turned to a small notebook he was holding. "I believe that a much better job could have been done in collecting the blood evidence. If the blood-soaked soil samples had been properly analyzed, a much more accurate estimate of the total amount of blood at the scene could have been made." The attorney continued, "Based on your examination of the evidence collected, do you have an opinion as to the actual amount of blood at the crime scene?" "I believe it is quite possible that as little as a pint and a half of blood could have created the scene that was recorded." One final question. Do you think a person who lost as much blood as depicted in the photographs could have survived? Dr. Wilbur answered with a one-word answer, yes. The district attorney did not cross-examine him. After Dr. Wilbur was removed, Basil Smith turned to the testimony of Blake Moore. Blake calmly and bluntly stated that he was innocent of the murder of Mark Evans and personally believed that it was Mark himself who orchestrated his murder. He also stated that he had never owned a gun, and that the shovels found in the river could well have been stolen from one of his company's work sites. Basil Smith wanted to keep the testimony simple and quickly turned his first witness over to the prosecutor for cross-examination. Jeff Bagdon's first question was, "What makes you think Mark Evans was a man who would organize his own murder?" Blake Moore immediately recounted Mark's reaction in high school when Blake started dating his girlfriend behind Mark's back. He recounted how Mark had threatened to destroy him. The prosecutor pondered this for a few minutes and then asked, "So, Mr. Moore, this isn't the first time you've ventured into an illicit affair with a woman Mark Evans hoped to protect from the interference of his best friend. Don't you think that if he wanted to destroy someone, he would have chosen you?" Blake Moore couldn't answer that question directly, only muttering that he had a physical advantage over Mark and that it would have prevented his former friend from straightening him out. "So you think you were able to physically intimidate your best friend and take his life by proxy? Is that what allowed you to feel comfortable taking his wife? Is that what your actions towards your alleged best friend are? You don't need to answer those questions, sir. I think we can all see that your actions and assumptions are those of a narcissistic ladies' man who thinks every woman is his, and to hell with friendship." Basil quickly objected on the grounds that the district attorney was himself testifying, not just asking questions. The judge agreed and asked the jury to disregard the prosecutor's last statement. However, even this remark failed to rebut the district attorney's point. Blake was visibly upset at the way he had been treated by the prosecutor, but left the stand without saying another word. Basil Smith realized that his witness's testimony had not worked as planned, but hoped that the testimony of Mark Evans's wife would turn the tide. Blake's testimony and the prosecutor's unanswered questions made Blake look bad in front of the jury. One could only hope it wouldn't affect their opinion of Lisa. This morning, Lisa Evans seemed to have her emotions under control when she appeared in court. The defense attorney asked her essentially the same questions as Blake. She categorically stated that she was not involved in any attack on her husband. She stated categorically that she loved her husband and would never participate in any attempt to physically hurt him. When asked about what might have happened to him, she suggested that he might have been carjacked. Again, Basil Smith chose not to ask further questions of his witness. When the prosecutor began asking Lisa questions, he began by saying, "Can you tell me where you were between midnight Saturday, when your husband sent his last email, and 2 o'clock Sunday afternoon?" Lisa was embarrassed by such a question and replied, "I told Mr. Smith where I was. I was with Blake Moore at his house from 8 o'clock Saturday night until about 1:30 p.m. Sunday." "You didn't exactly answer the question, did you? I'd like you to tell us what you did from midnight on Saturday until you got home on Sunday." Lisa was agitated and confused. Finally, she said, "Well, I was in Blake's bedroom at midnight and we were doing it." She was forced to finish the sentence because the prosecutor at every hesitation suggested she continue. "How long has this, shall we say, been going on?" He froze, waiting for her answer. We, 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 we eventually went to bed at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. It must have been a little after 1 o'clock. Lisa was again very embarrassed when she answered. So from midnight to 1 a.m. you were doing this, and then you went to bed. Then what? Please continue the chronology. Well, we slept until about 5:45, I think. I remember getting up to go to the bathroom. The district attorney asked, Was Mr. Moore in bed when you woke up? Please continue. Yes, he was there. We went back to business and went to bed around 6:30 and got up around 11 a.m. Her answer started slowly, but as she spoke, the words came out faster as she was clearly anxious to finish her statement. So when you came back from the bathroom, Mr. Moore started doing it with you, and that lasted until about 6:30 a.m., after which you both went back to bed. Is that correct? Is that how it happened? Lisa was very embarrassed and replied, No, it wasn't exactly like that. He didn't wake up when I went back to bed. I was the one who woke him up. The DA was clearly surprised by her answer, but quickly came to his senses and asked, You woke him up. What did you do? Shake him by the shoulder until he woke up so you could suggest he accept the offer. Lisa looked confused and replied, No, I mean, he was already ready. She seemed to be struggling to squeeze the words out of herself as she gave this answer. The district attorney realized that he had succeeded in finding common ground with the jury, as the 4 female jurors clearly seemed offended by her answers. He decided to continue this line of questioning. Tell us how you woke him up, whether you shook him by the shoulder. Lisa seemed resigned to continuing to answer, especially after Judge Cox overruled her attorney's objections. I just started doing it to him. That's when he woke up. She blushed profusely and kept her head turned away from the jury, which was the exact opposite of what her attorney had suggested. He asked them both to look into the jury's eyes to see if they were sincere. Now Jeff Bagden was ready for the coup de grace. Earlier, you told your attorney that you love your husband. Is that true? He waited for a firm yes from Lisa, accompanied by a vigorous nod of the head. Then he continued. I'm a little confused. You tell us how much you love your husband, but you just finished describing how you spent the night he killed himself. That night you spent in his best friend's bed and acted like a woman who disrespects her husband. How can we believe that you couldn't have been involved in his death? He stood and waited for a few moments, but it was obvious that Lisa wasn't going to answer his last question. She cried quietly, hiding her face in her palms. Judge Cox finally put an end to her suffering by asking if there were any more questions for the defendant or follow-up questions from the defense. When everyone answered that there were none, the judge announced that the court would recess for lunch. The courtroom was nearly empty when Lisa finally pulled herself together and left the witness stand, joining her attorney and client. The 3 of them went to a very somber lunch, during which the experienced attorney warned them that the case could go either way. Privately, he was somewhat more pessimistic as both of his clients had failed on the witness stand. The afternoon court session ended quickly when Basil Smith announced that there were no more defense witnesses. Both attorneys prepared for their closing statements, neither of which came as a surprise. The prosecutor told the jury that there were too many explanations for the innocence of both defendants. Defense counsel emphasized the circumstantial nature of the case, the absence of a body, the possibility that he might be alive, and the fact that no real motive had been offered for Mark's murder. The case was submitted to the jury at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and they deliberated for 2 hours before retiring for the night. The next morning, Lisa and Blake went to Basil Smith's office to await the news that the jury had reached a verdict. While the 2 clients waited in one of the conference rooms, Basil Smith was attending to other business. He warned them that it could be a long time before they heard from the courthouse, and he was right. Despite having to share a conference room, Lisa and Blake put aside their differences and talked about the chances of acquittal. Both held out hope, but neither could accept that the jury would find them guilty of murder. Finally, at 3:30 p.m., the bell rang. The jury had decided their fate. Lisa's parents were in town for the trial, although they were not present at the courthouse during her testimony. She was very grateful to them for that, as it meant they didn't hear her confessions at the trial. They had been in constant communication with the court throughout the day and were informed when it became known that the jury had reached their verdict. Lisa was relieved to feel their support sitting at the defense table next to her attorney. The announcement of the verdict happened very quickly. Lisa and Blake were found guilty of second-degree murder. Neither of them could believe it, and Lisa burst into tears again, while Blake pounded his fist on the table in frustration. A couple minutes later, they were already handcuffed and taken into the custody of the sheriff's deputies on duty. Lisa only had a couple minutes to talk to her parents and confess her innocence. Being normal parents, they joined in her grief. Before the two convicted murderers were taken to their cells, they were told that they would be back in a week for sentencing. It was a very bad ending to a difficult day. The week between conviction and sentencing passed quickly. During this time, Lisa's parents visited her daily, and Blake was visited once by a cousin. His parents were dead, and he was an only child. The week passed very slowly for him, and he soon realized how slowly time stretches when you are incarcerated. He also began to realize how bad his future looked. Lisa was still in denial about his future and refused to talk about it when his parents brought it up. Fortunately, the sentencing announcement only took a few minutes. Both received sentences ranging from 15 years to life. Basil Smith was sympathetic to their situation and said he would review court documents to see if an appeal was possible. After the sentencing, events moved very quickly. Within 3 days, both convicts were transferred from a local jail to a state prison. The women's prison to which Lisa was assigned had a good reputation, but the same could not be said for the prison to which Blake was sent. It had been the site of numerous riots over the past few years. Now that the trial and sentencing was over, the local media was no longer covering the case. Recent reports by local TV stations showed scenes of prisoners being transported in a converted school bus to the state prison. They may even have been stock footage used to make the TV stories brief, telling the fates of the two convicted criminals. A few days later, there were new disasters and new crimes that caught the attention of news anchors. Lisa Evans and Blake Moore seemed to disappear off the face of the earth. A couple months after the verdict, Basil Smith joined Jeff Bagden for a drink after a new case brought them back together. The Evans murder case had occupied Basil Smith from time to time, and he told Jeff, "You really pursued them. To tell you the truth, I was surprised when the convictions were handed down. I came to the conclusion that they were probably innocent as they never once recanted." Jeff sipped his brandy and replied, 12 of their peers didn't believe their explanations. I try not to take these cases personally, though it's almost impossible when it comes to crimes or children that are too horrible. This case wasn't the worst case I've ever handled, but it didn't make me particularly sympathetic to the defendant either. It only works if a jury decides. Basil Smith thought about his tablemate's statement and said, I guess you're right, but this case still bothers me. About a year later, there was a small item in the news about a major disturbance at the men's prison. As he read the article, Basil Smith singled out one name, and it got him thinking about the case again. Blake Moore had been stabbed during the riot and was transferred to the hospital for treatment of a collapsed lung. The article stated that he was in serious condition but would survive. It had been almost 18 months since Lisa Evans and Blake Moore were convicted of the murder of Mark Evans. Enough time had passed that even Basil Smith rarely thought about the case that had kept him busy for the entire first year since he had represented the defendants. He had scrutinized the transcripts several times in his spare time, but could find no legal grounds for appeal. There was not a single error in the law that he could use to the advantage of the two convicted murderers. It was a relatively quiet Wednesday morning in the New York office of the Innocence Project. The receptionist had just returned from her morning coffee break and was distracted for a moment to check her appearance in the small mirror when a FedEx courier approached her desk with a package. It was one of those large padded envelopes regularly used for interoffice delivery of information and goods that business and industry simply can't do without. And it was due to be delivered as early as yesterday. The secretary signed the electronic notepad offered to her and then watched as a young man dressed in a summer uniform, a t-shirt and shorts, walked out of the office. The nature of her thoughts could only be known by herself, but the mischievous smile on her face would have given a clue to anyone who witnessed the whole event. In this case, the only person in the reception area was an attractive young black woman sitting behind the receptionist's desk. The package was addressed simply to the office, so she opened it to determine how the contents should be disposed of. Inside, she found a DVD, a sealed black plastic bag with a biohazard label, and a multi-page letter. Since she had no pressing business to attend to at the moment, she began reading the letter. It took several minutes, and the gamut of emotions that flashed across her face as she read the letter would have intrigued any observer of what was going on. No one else entered the office after the stout FedEx man left, so her expressive reactions again went unnoticed. After she finished reading the letter, she sat pensive for a while, then picked up the phone and pressed one of the intercom buttons, waited a few seconds, and then said, "Tony, could you come out to see us for a minute? We just received a package that I think you'll be interested in." She sat and listened for almost 15 seconds before she continued. "Yes, it seems to be something the team can work on. It deals with several murder convictions that obviously need to be overturned." About a minute later, a tall, red-haired young man in a white short-sleeved shirt and worn jeans came out of one of the offices overlooking the reception area, thanked her, took the package, and disappeared again behind the door he had come out of. The smartly dressed young man turned out to be Tony Kelly, a recently graduated lawyer who had decided that before chasing a high-paying associate position at a Wall Street law firm, he should devote some time to the public good. He'd been at the Innocence Project for almost a year, doing mostly basic legal research for the more senior lawyers who'd founded the office a few years earlier. While he knew he wasn't going to stay there for the rest of his career, he enjoyed making a difference in the lives of those who had been wrongfully convicted of serious crimes. Returning to a comfortable swivel chair behind a relatively cheap plywood desk, he laid the contents of the FedEx envelope on the bureau and picked up the letter, casting a quick glance at the DVD and sealed package. Leaning back in the chair and placing his Nike sneaker-clad feet on the corner of the desk, he began to read the letter. The letter was typed on the computer in an easy-to-read font, and he quickly immersed himself in its contents. The Innocence Project in New York, regarding the convictions for the murders of Lisa Evans and Blake Moore. I don't know where to begin, so I'll start at the beginning. That way I can put things in order and hopefully not forget anything important. My name isn't that important, but the information I've been asked to give you could make a real difference in the lives of not only the two convicted murderers named above, but the future well-being and happiness of 5 other people, one of whom is me. I'll start with the day almost 15 months ago when, in response to an ad I placed in the local newspaper, a man came to me from the street. I was looking for a computer-literate person to join me in my small computer services company. A short interview revealed that he knew at least as much about computers and their use in business networks as I did. I have since learned that he knows even more than I do. Be that as it may, I hired him right away. This man, who I will refer to as Mark throughout this letter, was probably the quietest person I have met in a while. This had no effect on his ability to do his job, which he did very, very well. Within 2 months, my business grew by at least 50% due to his efforts, advice, and the long hours he seemed to insist on working. When he started working for me, he told me that he had just arrived in town and hadn't rented a place yet. Since my business was still in its infancy, I thought about renting out the basement space in our house for additional income. I wanted to be able to put the profits from my business back into it so that it would grow and eventually provide a living for me and my young son. I knew I was taking a risk when I rented the room to Mark, but something about him convinced me that he wasn't a threat to us. We began living a routine that has remained to this day, although the dynamics have changed. For the first 3 months, he lived in a bedroom in the basement, but he ate with us, and we commuted to and from work together every day. At first, he always came back to the office to work extra hours that he didn't ask to be paid for. He always told me that he would rather spend that time being productive than in front of the TV or sleeping. Over time, our relationship evolved from a boss-employee relationship to one of friendship and eventually to what it has become now, a loving family relationship. My son calls him Dad, and it is truly true in every way. From the very beginning, I realized that something was bothering Mark a lot. Over time, his extremely quiet nature and his habit of often going into deep thought about things I knew nothing about led to a sort of confrontation between us. One afternoon, when the office was very quiet, I locked the door and called him into my private office. I was determined to find out what was bothering him so much as I began to realize how my feelings for him were developing. It took some time, but I convinced him to share what was bothering him. He eventually told me that he was running from a failed marriage that had shaken him to his core. He told me that his wife had betrayed him along with a good friend and that he had almost committed murder and suicide because of it. We continued to talk for the rest of the day, sharing our worries about unfaithful spouses. My husband left me for another woman, and Mark left his wife because of her relationship with another man. We found common ground, and our conversation seemed to help him overcome one of the last obstacles he faced in getting over his past life. This conversation was also the catalyst that brought us together. We began meeting on weekends, maintaining two separate relationships, employer and employee during the week, and man and woman on Saturdays. After a month of this relationship, it got to the point where it no longer made sense for him to keep his bedroom in the basement, and he moved into my bedroom. From that point on, we became a family, although I still felt like he was hiding something from me. We continued our relationship, growing as a couple. I know I love him, and I'm sure he loves me and my son. I really should say our son, because that is how he feels about him. The boy is about to turn 4 and needs a loving relationship with his father, something his biological father has utterly failed to provide. He hasn't seen his biological father since he was too young to remember him. This is exactly the situation we found ourselves in 4 days ago, when Mark collapsed at work. It took 3 days in the ICU before it was determined that his problem was heart-related, and that he would need open heart surgery to correct a condition that seemed to have been with him since birth. Once his condition stabilized, he was moved to a private room. Now he was awake and we could finally talk to each other. When I first walked into his room, I knew immediately that something was wrong and that it was seriously bothering him. It was then that he told me the story that he was afraid he was going to die with him if he didn't have heart surgery. It was very important to him to finally close the door on this episode in his life. He told me the story throughout the day, and when I agreed to print it for him and see that it got into your hands, it felt like the weight of the world had been lifted off his shoulders. Now he's asleep, and I'm typing this on my laptop, and our son is lying on the bed next to him sleeping too. I think I'll have most of the night to finish this letter. I still need to get home, create a DVD, which I'll talk about later, and pick up a few more things before I can send this information to you. I really want the letter to be ready by tomorrow afternoon. The problem of sending the letter from a place that will not allow you to trace its return to us must also be addressed. The story my husband told me, which is what he is to me, began almost 2 years ago. He was happily married to Lisa, and their marriage was almost in its 6th year. One evening, without knowing himself why it caught his attention, he noticed a small oval bruise on the side of her right breast. At first, he thought it was just a bump that appeared when she hit a corner of furniture at home or in the office where she worked as a part-time secretary. He said it began to bother him as he lay there, as it looked more like a love bite than a bruise, and he knew it was through no fault of his own. Thinking about it kept him awake most of the night. More and more scenarios of how that bruise came to be popped up in his head. Thoughts about it didn't leave him the next day when he went to work. When he got to his office, he decided he had done something stupid. After all, he had absolutely no evidence that anything bad had happened. He decided that it was all just circumstantial evidence. Just before lunch, the manager of the parts delivery department stopped by his office. He had ordered a tracking device for a trial run to better coordinate the delivery service. He wanted Mark to evaluate it and make recommendations. Mark was left with the device, the software, and all the instructions on how to use it. It didn't take him long to decide how he would test it. 3 days after installing the device in his wife's car, he was sitting at his desk at work and decided to test the monitor program to make sure it was still monitoring his wife's car. She told him she was going shopping after lunch, but the tracking device showed that she had left the house and headed straight for the home of Blake Moore, his best friend. An hour later, he checked again, but her car was still parked there. Not believing something was going on, he called her cell phone. When she answered that she had gone out for shopping, he immediately realized that something had gone wrong. In the evening, he casually asked how her day had gone and was forced to listen to her explanation about the shopping trip. He told me that he felt almost physically sick, but he decided he shouldn't jump to conclusions. He decided to observe her for another week while he was out of town on business. He managed to follow her car through 3 states when she spent time at Blake's house from 8 o'clock in the evening until 2 o'clock in the morning. When he spoke to her the next day, she told him that she had been home all the previous night. Apparently, the shock of the confirmation of her infidelity was too much for him. When he returned from his trip, he contemplated destruction. He knew his friend Blake was a real ladies' man, but he never thought he would go after Lisa. Likewise, his wife's betrayal had nearly ripped his heart out. That first night back home, he visited the elderly widow next door, ostensibly to retrieve a wrench from her late husband's toolbox. Mark knew that her late husband had long ago hidden the gun at the bottom of his large toolbox, apparently because his wife had forbidden him to keep guns in the house. One day he showed it to Mark while the two of them were having a beer. Instead of taking a pipe wrench, Mark found and pulled a revolver out of the drawer. As he explained to me, he intended to use it to destroy Mark and Lisa and then kill himself. He decided he would wait until the next time they got together while he was in town. He would have no problem quitting his job and heading to Blake's to catch them together and get his revenge. Since he'll have to keep an eye on his wife's car for a few weeks, he orders one of the tracking devices for himself to return the one he was given to study. Luckily, Lisa and Blake didn't have to make a date for almost another week because if they had, my son and I never would have had the great pleasure of seeing Mark. In the days he had to wait for them to get together, he came up with a better plan. He decided to try and frame them for murder and described to me how he did it. It took a whole week to devise the plan and another week to get everything he needed to carry it out. When everything was ready, he made an excuse to go away on a business trip for the weekend, confident that the two would meet while he was out of town. After watching his wife's car during his absence, he finally saw her pull out of the house and head toward Blake. That was the signal to put his plan into action. He was creating a paper trail to make it look like he was in the process of divorcing his wife. The last item was a letter to the lawyer that would point directly to Lisa and Blake. Apparently, he had almost forgotten to send it, and that could mean the whole plan would fall apart. The last thing he did before leaving the house was fire a bullet from his neighbor's revolver into the passenger seat of his car and another into one of the wooden blocks he had assembled. The sound of the gunshot was muffled by an old blanket and the fact that he was in a closed garage. He told me that firing those bullets was a huge relief to him because he knew he had finally started down the path to his revenge. You should look for archived newspaper articles which can be found online. Mark followed the trial online daily and said that most of the story about what he did was written by court reporters. As he began to tell me about his actions, it all seemed to add up to one long story. I didn't want to interrupt him lest I forget to mention some detail. Also, get a copy of the court transcript. Mark thinks that all of them together should clear things up. The first thing he did was to drive his car to a park near Blake's house and find a secluded spot where he could make preparations for his death. A large gym bag was stuffed with everything he had accumulated for his plan, and he laid it all out on a picnic table, which he covered with an old blanket. The first thing he unloaded was the pieces of firewood, plastic sheeting, and the spare tire. Using the plastic on which he stacked the firewood and spare tire, he created an obvious path that led to the paved road. The tire was then returned to the trunk, the firewood was placed around the picnic area, and the plastic was put away. He used a small mag-light flashlight for all of this, and when he was done, he sat down quietly at the table to see if anyone would show up, noticing the flashes of light that occurred while he was setting everything up. Sitting down at the table, he inserted a large needle into his left arm to draw blood. He was able to buy everything he needed from a medical supply store, saying he was taking care of his elderly mother. The blood was collected in a homemade plastic bag, and the only thing he feared was that the blood would clot too much before he could dilute it with distilled water and pour it where it needed to go. It took him over an hour to collect almost 2 pints of his own blood, most of which he diluted with a pint of distilled water. The first thing he did with all the blood was fill a small plastic bottle and use it to spray the blood in a pattern that he hoped would resemble an arterial jet. Most of the remaining blood, mixed with water, was smeared on the car seat and the ground to give the impression that someone had lost a lot of blood. Some more whole blood was used to fill the bullet hole in the wood and the hole in the passenger seat upholstery. I hope I'm getting the details right because I don't really feel like waking him up to read this to him. He needs his rest, as he has surgery tomorrow afternoon. I pray that there are no complications and that he gets through the surgery. Regardless of whether I have all the details correct, there remains the matter of the DVD I am about to make for you. Mark took pictures, sort of before and after pictures, on his digital camera while he was doing everything in the park. He said there were even pictures of him drawing his own blood. I haven't seen them, but he gave me a password so I could access the photo files on our server at work. They've been sitting there since he started working with me, which I never knew about. His souvenirs, as he called them. Apparently the photos turned out pretty good, although he had to take them by the light of his little flashlight. He was afraid someone would see the flash if he used it. Anyway, finished with the car and the blood in the park, he packed everything into his gym bag and walked out of the park. On one of the side streets was an old car he'd bought specifically for this purpose, and he told me how he'd almost gotten to it. Despite drinking lots of fluids and taking supplements, when he got to the car he was very dizzy from blood loss. He rested in the car until almost 6 in the morning, but knew he still had to get to Blake's house to finish the job he had started. Lisa's car was still there, which he had in no way expected, and it was unlocked. He figured that was a real bonus for him, as he managed to squeeze a couple drops of blood onto the gas pedal. As he moved from Lisa's car to Blake's car, he realized that there was a dim light on in Blake's bedroom, and he was very scared that one of them had seen him. As soon as he smeared the blood on Blake's car, he hurriedly drove away from there. From Blake's house, he went to a payphone on the opposite side of the park. Just after dawn, he called 911 on the payphone to report his car in the park. He installed a professional voice changer on the phone, purchased from a spy store in Pittsburgh, and used it so that he would be mistaken for a woman. This worked great, as he could change the timbre, tone, and pitch of his voice. He then went to a dock on the river where he lowered 2 Blake shovels and a revolver into the water. When he had done all this, he told me that he felt very exhausted. It seemed to him that up to this point he had felt a rush of strength from the realization that nothing had gone wrong in his plan. There was a small motel about a mile away where he had already gotten a room, and he had gone there to keep a low profile and rest. He spent 2 days there taking supplements and eating energy bars. I'm a little confused about the timeline, but at some point he came out with his voice changer and made another call, this time in the guise of an old man. This call helped the police find the revolver he had discarded. That's probably all he told me. I will read it to him in the morning and correct any mistakes. I really hope that when he sees that I have everything ready to print, he will be much calmer. The whole reason he told me this story and insisted that I send it to you is that he wants to break the last thread holding him back from his former life as Mark Evans. Sometime before coming here, he acquired the identity he now uses and by which my son and I know him. He wants to keep that identity and never be Mark Evans again. Please do everything you can to overturn the convictions of Lisa Evans and Blake Moore. Tomorrow, I'll pick up a copy of the New York Times and an inkwell. We'll use a piece of the front page to put all of Mark's fingerprints so they're clearly visible. Then we'll prick his finger and make a big blood stain on the paper. When it's compared to the DNA from the park, it will be proof that he's alive. All this should be enough to get them out of jail. That was the end of the computer-printed letter, but it was handwritten at the bottom. Mark came out of surgery in very good condition. He wants me to fly to Seattle tomorrow and mail this package. I hate to leave him, but I know he'll feel much better once it's sent. I told you before that this will affect 5 of us, but I see I never explained what I meant. Mark and I are expecting twins in about 3 months. Tony Kelly turned the last page to see if anything had been added to the back, but it was blank. He dangled his feet off the corner of the desk and turned to look at the other items in the package. The DVD was labeled, "Photos Taken in George Washington Park." On the back of the black plastic envelope was scrawled, "Fingerprints and DNA." He went through the printed pages one more time, checking for additional writing on the back of each, and then called one of the senior attorneys. He couldn't handle this alone. It took only a short time to confirm that the DNA did indeed belong to Mark Evans, and the fingerprints confirmed that he was still alive when they were compared to the prints taken from his car found in the park. Faced with irrefutable evidence that the 2 men had been convicted of a murder that never happened, the state attorney general and governor expedited their release. A week later, they were back in the courtroom where they were convicted, along with Basil Smith, Lisa's parents, and even District Attorney Jeff Bagden and several state representatives. The state attorney general apologized to the court system and the state for their botched conviction. He also stated that there is no doubt that the blame for the whole unfortunate case lies with Mark Evans. The judicial system worked, but through the efforts of one determined individual, it was diverted from justice. He then stated that their department would make every possible effort to find Mark Evans and hold him accountable for the considerable amount of money he had caused the city and state to spend. The cost of police, forensics, litigation, and jail time will be tallied, and he intends to seek reimbursement. Charges will also be filed. However, when asked by a reporter if they had any idea where to start looking for Mark Evans, he only shook his head. Blake Moore seemed to have changed for the better. The cocky and arrogant man had been replaced by someone who seemed much more inclined to compromise. He apologized to Lisa for instigating the chain of events that had resulted in them spending almost a year and a half in prison. Lisa didn't seem to care in the slightest. She seemed desperate and longed for one thing: to leave the courthouse with her parents. Before the two of them left, both Basil Smith and the district attorney apologized for what had happened. Both attorneys felt they had been badly misled by the machinations of Mark Evans. It seemed to both of them that they should have been smarter than to be duped by a vindictive husband. Later, they both decided that they would have to pay much more attention to the details of future cases. Although the state's attorney concluded that the state was not liable, Lisa and Blake received a payment of $50,000, waiving the right to further legal action or compensation. Shortly after receiving the check, Blake Moore left town. His business went bankrupt and his house was sold to pay his legal fees. There was nothing else holding him back. The only thing he said to Lisa after they were handed the checks: "Mark really screwed us over, didn't he? This check is just a fraction of what my house and business would be worth if he hadn't found out about us. I hate to say I told you this, but I knew he was setting us up." Lisa was still only a shadow of her old self. She had lost the house she and Mark owned to non-payment and foreclosure. She had also lost weight in prison, but had acquired what you might call wrinkles of worry that weren't there before. She looked hopelessly lost and accepted the check as if it were just a piece of paper. Slipping it into her purse, she said, "I think we deserve it, Blake. I don't even care about the time I spent in jail. It only cost me 18 months of my life, but I lost Mark forever." She left with her parents without even saying goodbye. 2 weeks after the cable TV story about Lisa and Blake's release, a large envelope arrived at attorney Basil Smith's office with a courier. Inside was a short note to the attorney and a sealed envelope addressed to Lisa Evans. He had made an appointment to give her the letter on his way home. At exactly 5 o'clock that evening, the lawyer knocked on Lisa's apartment. After a short and polite conversation, he left her standing at the door, looking at the envelope with apprehension and a little hope. Finally, taking the envelope to the kitchen and looking at it for a few more long seconds, she opened it. The familiar handwriting on the envelope told her that it was a letter from Mark, and she realized that she simply had to read what it said. "Lisa, I would like to apologize for making you spend so much time in jail. I've never been vindictive, but the fact that you and Blake betrayed me has practically driven me insane. My new life and the happiness I've found has finally made me realize that until I freed you both, I was just as much a prisoner as you were. I know the authorities will be looking for me for some time to come, but I am confident that I am safe in my new life, with my new family. Good luck to you, and goodbye. M." The short letter slipped from her hands and flew to the floor, taking with it the last faint hope of reconciliation with Mark. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Subscribe to my channel and stay tuned for the next videos.